it only means that it makes it even more difficult to access education, to access knowledge, to access books. And I think that's a very, very major step backwards for our nation.
So in terms of the free primary education and subsidized secondary education efforts that the government has made so far, do you feel that this VAT bill will actually help to forward these steps, or will it take us back?
Look at it this way. One is that until recently for the free primary education, we still had many pupils sharing textbooks, simply because there weren't enough funds to enable every child to have their own textbook per subject. Mm-hmm. And that's still a problem that we are experiencing around the nation. The government has been struggling, as you know, to be able to cope with the funding of free primary education. And you may remember the recent crisis that there was, where schools were almost shutting down simply because the disbursement had been delayed for that. Now, what this really means is that the government, which is already struggling to fund free primary education, will find itself with a higher bill to pay. In other words, if they were able to only provide funding to a certain level and they maintain that level, it means textbooks will be unavailable in schools. And secondly, that it will be more difficult for them to cope with the increased bill for providing materials for secondary school and primary schools. Now, the implication of that is you will have children in schools, but because they don't have learning materials, because the book is the key tool, is the core tool for learning, it basically means that the quality of learning will drastically go down. And although every year we will be giving news of the many numbers of students who are graduating out of primary and high school, but the question will be, what quality of learning shall we be talking about? So it reduces the quality of learning. Okay. Now, the impact of that is, again, you will have people going into the school system, eventually into the job market, who have certificates of having learned, but not properly educated, simply because they learned, they missed that opportunity to engage with books and do quality learning. And again, when you feed that back into the system, it means that Kenya will have a very big problem in being competitive regionally and globally, because when you don't have human capital that can compete effectively, it basically means that we will be getting further, not closer, to what we are calling Vision 2030. I think the big problem we see with the government is the disconnect between what the government is saying wants to achieve in the long term and their actions today. Because the action of introducing VAT on books is basically taxing knowledge, making it more difficult for people to access knowledge. And we know that this is a knowledge economy. The global economy is a knowledge economy. And if you want to tax knowledge, make it more difficult for people to access that knowledge, we then can't talk of innovation. We can't talk of economic development or economic takeoff. That is just a pipe dream. We think the government's action is retrogressive. We think the government's action basically goes against Vision 2030. And we think that the government is basically starting to reverse the gains it has made by empowering the Kenyan people to become whatever they want to be. Because that's what every developed nation ensures, that their people can become whoever they want to be, because they have created that enabling environment.
Okay, Mr. David, the opinions that you're expressing on this, when you say we think this and we think this, do they represent the publisher's opinion, or do they represent your opinions as a father or as an investor in education in our country?
Well, Florence, I wear different hats. The first one, obviously, is as a father who has, brought up two children, and knowing what the cost of buying textbooks has been, to just imagine that that cost will almost double by just the introduction of the VAT bill in itself is quite scary. And when I think that a majority of Kenyans, struggle on a day-to-day basis to just put one meal on the table, so overtaxing them for accessing knowledge will probably even be really, really bad for them. Secondly, is as a publisher, and I'm saying that because I've traveled around the world, and I can tell you that Kenya will be among very few nations in the world that tax knowledge and that tax books. Very, very few people, if any. It's a very retrogressive, action to take. And as a publishing fraternity, we are saying that I think the government should be much more considerate to the people that have elected them to represent their interests, not to work against their interests. Okay. Now, secondly, is that as a publishing fraternity, we will end up being not competitive in the region. In fact, people buying Kenyan books will probably find it, Kenyan books will be cheaper in other markets than they will be in Kenya. And so the publishing fraternity will probably be feeding other economies better than our own economy. And that's another reason. The other hat I wear is that, as a treasurer of the Kenya Publishers Association, we champion the rights of the Kenyan reader, and not just those in the school system, but also the general reader like yourself and I. We know that reading does not end with formal schooling or formal education. Reading ought to be a lifelong engagement. It ought to be a lifelong pursuit. And when people stop reading, it means you stop feeding your imagination. And you need to be reading at whatever stage you are, whether in the younger ages, in the middle years, or in the later years, simply because reading helps us imagine. It helps us develop, creative, critical thinking skills, and that is what will make our nation advance. So I'm also talking on behalf of the wider Kenyan reading community. Okay. Florence, remember that there's a huge debate that has been going on for very many years. The debate that Kenya is not a reading, society. We don't have that reading culture. What my position is that we have a bit of a reading culture, but it is not well developed for good reasons. Most of them economic, the inability of most people to be able to access books. So again, if we tax that, the government taxes that, it means it will be even worse. And probably we will be talking of an ignorant, illiterate nation in 2030 rather than a middle-income nation.
Mr. David, when you're talking about this tax, you talked in the beginning about how cumulative it is. It's not just 16%, as you mentioned. It keeps increasing from production to publishing to distribution. How much higher will the cost of a textbook be? How expensive are we talking?
Our estimates are that books actually will go up by anything between 50% and 70%. That's our estimate. Okay. Now, remember that apart from the inputs into printing books and taxing books themselves, there are other costs that relate to production. For example, right now, electricity, we pay only about 12% VAT on electricity. This bill proposes to increase to, the VAT paid on electricity from 12% to 16%. Okay. Now, that alone has direct impact on production. So although it is not on books, there will be other cumulative impact on raising the cost of books. And our estimate that it may be at a minimum 50%, but it could very well go up to about 70%.
Wow. Will this bill only affect printed books, like we're talking about textbooks and exercise books, or are there other things that it's going to actually affect the price?
Yes, trade books as well. Textbooks, trade books, and trade books are basically the books for general reader, the general readership. Okay. And it also proposes to tax e-commerce, meaning that for any trade, for any buyers from overseas, buying books from Kenya, that will also go up. And so e-books as well will be taxed.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So what does this mean to the reading culture that we're trying to promote in Kenya? Does it mean that now reading will be left to the elite in society, or does it mean that now people will have to cross over the borders to buy cheaper books and come and read them in Kenya? What do you think?
Several scenarios are likely to play out. Number one is that pirating, the government is basically pushing people to pirate for those who must read and for those who must engage in business. Most likely what we'll do is when legitimate businesses like ours, who must charge legitimately the VAT imposed by government, and because people can't afford, the business with pirates will basically go up, simply because they can steal our innovations, they will steal our ideas, and go and get those books printed in a crooked way, offer them, roll them out in the market very, very cheaply. So we are likely going to see illegitimate black market getting back. And again, that's something that we have been fighting for a very long time. Now, that's a real disaster. The second thing is that if people can't access a book, they basically will go back and laze out. They will be entertained by all the other media, the video games and all that. And so we will have more couch potatoes. And you know what that does to imagination and creativity, because it is passive, passive entertainment. So we will end up having, in one generation's time, you will end up having people who lack imagination, who lack creativity, and it will work against the future of this nation. Our posterity is threatened. That's scenario number 2. Scenario number 3 is that if then publishers and the entire book industry is pushed out of business, what implication does it have for our own culture? Because it's not just about textbooks and all that. You remember, publishing really is a reservoir of a people's culture. We are going to lose out on that. We will lose out on, Kenyan authors probably being published out there, and their books will be too expensive to be published here. So we will have very little to celebrate as a people. And these are very many areas in which we hope the government would look at the entire impact of the VAT bill. It just affects too many areas.
Okay. Today we're asking you, do you support the taxation bill on book publishing? Do you support the taxation bill on book publishing? Send us your SMSs with your answers and opinions on 32223, starting with the word afternoon live. The question is, do you support the taxation bill on book publishing? You can also send us an email on afternoonlive@kbc.co.ke. Join our conversation. Let us know what you feel about the issue that we're talking about today. Now, Mr. David, don't you feel that since the government is paying salaries, improving infrastructure, that actually this taxation may actually go into supporting some of these projects that are supporting education in our country?
Florence, it's a question of chicken and egg. It's a chicken and egg situation. We obviously believe that government must find a way of meeting all the obligations that we, the people, expect them to meet. But in so doing, we expect that there ought to be imagination and there ought to be creativity in the way government approaches this. Overtaxing a few people does not provide the solution. That's at least my personal position. I think the government needs to be to change that paradigm. It's actually what one of our authors would call, it's a poverty mentality, where you think that you must get everything that you need from one person, two people, 100,000 people, 1 million people. whereas this nation comprises of over 40 million people who have the ability, the capacity, and could have the know-how if government doesn't cut off their access to knowledge, could have the know-how to be contributors to the economy. What we are saying is that the government should open up participation in our economy to everybody. What the government is doing right now is will end up shutting out a majority of the people, what you would call the bottom of the pyramid. They're shutting out the bottom of the pyramid from active participation in the economy by trying to overtax a few, just a few people. So we are saying the government should be able to do this, but the question is, what do we do that has the greatest potential of unleashing the potential of Kenyans into the future to help us achieve Vision 2030? Is that decision to ensure that, is that decision to cut off access to knowledge among the majority of the people? Our answer is no. Is the way to generate resources, to build infrastructure right now, to make people not be able to access education? Absolutely not. So what we are saying, it's just the model. The model we are working on is an old model. Keep overtaxing. The example of telephony is a very simple example. There is a time in Kenya, just about 11, 12 years ago, where only 100,000 or 200,000 people owned handsets by way of mobile telephones. But the company that was doing that at that time was in red. It was a loss-making company. What happened when mobile telephony was opened up to the majority of the people, to the bottom of the pyramid? So would you rather have 100 or 200,000 people with mobile phones, or would you rather have 21 million Kenyans actively trading and conducting their business on mobile phone? Which is a better model? The government is operating on the old paradigm, where you shut out the majority, operate with a few, overtax them. It is loss-making. We will not be able to get to Vision 2030. We, I think, the government ought to change the paradigm and create an environment where all Kenyans can participate. And that way, even if it's lower taxes over 21 million people, you end up getting higher revenues. Some of the models we have seen lately, like Equity Bank. Remember, banking was the preserve of a few elite people just about 10 years ago, until Equity Bank came onto the scene. And they changed the paradigm.
Mr. David, don't you feel there are enough books in circulation that are already not even being read, that people have not even gone into bookshops to buy, to start saying that we need more books to come into at lower prices so that people can start reading?
Progress feeds on innovation. And Florence, what brought us here as a nation, or what has brought you and I this far, will not necessarily take us to the future. And that is the place of innovation. In other words, if you have to advance, if you have to go forward, you have to keep innovating. And so the knowledge of yesterday, simply because we did research and we found some new knowledge or new truth yesterday, doesn't mean that it will be a constant into the future. And what we are saying is that we need to feed the imagination, the minds of Kenyans, so that we can make progress at a faster pace. And if you look at the Far East Asian tigers, as an example, those countries like Singapore were at par with Kenya at independence about 49 years ago. We were at par. In fact, Kenya's per capita income was slightly higher than that of Singapore. About 48 years later, the per capita income of Singapore is $60,000 per year. Kenya's per capita income is about 1,700. And it's simply because we are still in the old thinking, we are crawling. We are thinking, why do we need anything new? But countries like those ones are innovating every single day. And that's why they basically, their economy has become, one of the greatest examples in the world of a developing, emerging economy, while Kenya's is still at where we were so many years ago. So it's the question of knowledge. We cannot shut out knowledge from people. The government ought to encourage, rather than muzzle, the acquisition of knowledge, empowering people with knowledge. We just can't say we had it. It's just like saying I passed my examination and so I don't need to acquire more knowledge. Sooner rather than later, cobwebs will start forming around your head, and your good certificate will be of absolutely no good because you'll be relegated to irrelevance. That's why we need new knowledge, discovered every day, disseminated every day, Kenyans engaging, every single day with new knowledge.
But don't you feel that even with more books coming in at cheaper prices, we still have a problem with people reading books? What do you feel, in your opinion, can be a measure or an incentive to encourage people to read, so that it's not a complete waste, that we're saying that books should come in at 0 rated, but people are not reading? What should be done?
A couple of things. Some of them are probably, one of it is actually economic, because you think about it. I don't know what the current statistics are, but a few years ago, over 60% of Kenyans lived below the poverty line, meaning that putting a meal, and even what you call a meal, is not necessarily a decent meal on the table. Now, right now, the figures could be probably 50% of Kenyans living below the poverty line. Now, so the first issue to address is a very basic issue, because a majority of people, to the extent they are only struggling with survival, it basically means that they don't have that disposable income to go and buy a book. So, and that's why we are saying that dealing with the economy, to free up the economy for the majority of people to participate, is the very first key thing. Now, the second thing, reading is all about self-actualization. How can you talk about self-actualization when you're struggling with one meal in a day? So that's number one. Secondly, is sometimes our education system. Now, I said, as a parent, I always look at my children from the time they went to school, the load of books that, the number of subjects they have to cover, the load of books, the homework they go back to school with, even over that spreads over the weekends, that spreads over holiday time. What do you think that does? Now, textbook reading is obviously, very, very important. However, we still need to free our kids to imagine things, to play, to read books that are not necessarily, textbooks, general reading, to feed their imagination. Now, and so we need to look at our educational system as well, and that's why when many children, many people get out of the school system, it's like they throw the book aside.
They actually ban books.
They actually ban books.
Yes.
Now now when you look at the models around the world, people are encouraged to read at a very, very early stage, and because the books are accessible, and because learning is not seen as a punishment. Learning in schools is not seen as a punishment, but as a way of becoming and acquiring knowledge. So it's all integrated from home into the school, into the working life, and that's why when you travel around the world, you'll always see people don't just go to a bus stop and stare at every passing bus, and and when they get into the bus and they probably have 1 hour riding into the bus, they're just staring out of the windows, or listening to very loud music. You will see people engaged in books simply because that's something that they grew along with. So again, we need to look at our educational system so that it has the flexibility for children to be children. It has the flexibility for children to explore beyond the textbook and read general books. And all that. Okay.
Mr. David, so in your opinion, you're saying people are not reading, or our society is not reading, because our education system does not allow for that culture of reading to come out, because people are either doing homework, or they're stressed, or they have a lot of workload in school. Is that what you're trying to say?
That's a reality. It's a tension we have to deal with. Now, if a child comes with 5 homework, 5 homeworks, some of them 50 questions, they start off from the time they get into the house all the way to 10 o'clock. When will they read a book, for leisure, to help their imagination? If that goes through the weekend and into the holidays. So that's one factor. Now, the second factor, obviously, we are saying is economic. The third factor is basically that of enabling Kenyans to live a less stressful life, because the life of a Kenyan can be very stressful. Whether you talk of what time do people wake up to go to work, travel distances of 15 kilometers over a period of 3 hours. By the time they get to work, they are already tired. Their travel back home will take another 2 to 4 hours. And basically a number of Kenyans live very high stress kind of lives. And I think what we are saying is that the government ought to plan for the future in a way that frees up Kenyans, their energy, their creativity, to create a better nation. Because it's not just the government's role to build the future. In fact, the government's role is not to build that future. It's to enable the Kenyans to build that future for themselves.
Okay, we need to take a break now. But when we come back, we're still discussing the Value-Added Tax Bill 2011 that proposes to remove printed products from zero-rated category. And you don't want to miss this. It's completely exciting. Join our conversation. Send us an SMS on 32223, starting with the word Afternoon Live.
ABC Channel 1, Kenya's watching.
My name is David Rudisha. I'm running 800 meters and I'm representing Kenya in coming London Olympics. We have a lot of hopes and we'll do our best. Thank you.
ABC Channel 1, Kenya's watching.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Afternoon Live. If you're just joining us, we're talking about the Value-Added Tax Bill 2011 that proposes to remove printed books from the zero rate tax category. And we've been here with Mr. David Waweru discussing this in depth. And before we went on break, we're talking about what this actually means to a lot of people, to the publishers, and to you as someone who's just watching this program. It does affect you because, as you had, the tax also affects ebooks that you might have thought you could just download easily from the internet, and that is something that is very important for you to hear today. What is, maybe we can just talk in depth of what this tax means to the publishers. For you, because it's important, you come from the publishing community and the publishing world. What do you hear people say and talk about from your perspective?
From the publisher's point of view, it obviously books will be more expensive. Mm-hmm. What this means is because people's disposable income, and even the biggest buyer, who is the government, particularly when it comes to textbooks, if their budgets don't go up, it basically means you will have a smaller market, to distribute books, to consume your books. And secondly, is that by a smaller market, it essentially means, particularly for the educational system, is that we will be denying our children in schools books. And the impact of this is that companies may have to reorganize, probably lay off staff, so it will give rise to unemployment. Mm. The second thing is that in the region, Kenyan books will be cheaper because the assumption is that there will be no VAT charged for export. It therefore means that Kenyan books will be cheaper in Uganda and Tanzania and Zambia and South Sudan, where Kenyan publishers operate. They are major suppliers in those markets. Mm. But Kenyan books will be cheaper in those markets. The other implication really is the question of, if the government is already struggling at the current budget level, to sufficiently fund free primary education, and the implication of taxation on books means the cost will go up 50, 60, 70%. Will the government be able to cope with such an increase in the annual budget? And with all the competing needs we are talking about, we tend to think that the government is actually shooting itself on the foot, because we don't see how and where they will suddenly be able to pay for such an increase when it comes to the cost of education.
Okay. Yeah, let's look at a few of your responses that you have sent us. Here, Nyawira from Nairobi says, no, they should first tax themselves before taking books. That's mean. Okay, do you have a response to that?
I think what Nyawira is saying is absolutely true. Now, look, the members of parliament have been manipulating the Kenyan people by trying to avoid paying taxes on their packs, 1 million or so packs. And they want to impose tax on Kenyans who are eking out a living by burning maize on the roadside and going about their daily chores, trying to maintain the burden on those members of parliament. They don't want to pay tax, but they want to tax that Kenyan farmer. They want to tax that Kenyan person pushing a mkokoteni to try and make out a living, because they too have children who are in school. So you can see the contradiction. They are completely, it's being disconnected with the reality. And that's why we hope that the next parliament and the next set of leaders will be more sensitive to the future of our nation. Now, secondly, when you look at the proposals by the Minister of Finance, in the last budget, what did he do? He proposed to lower or to abolish taxes on mitumba clothes.
Yes.
Now, the reason that was given is that Kenyans
Need to dress.
love mitumba. They should look well cheaply. But the reality, Florence, is that the key beneficiaries of the tax break on mitumba will not be the ordinary Kenyan.
No.
It will be the importers, and they are well connected. Some of them very well connected, in a political class. So they will get the tax break. They will make all their millions in terms of profit, and people will still buy mitumba at the same price of mitumba.
I actually read an article that on the same issue that was saying, is the government proposing mitumba over books? And it was...
Precisely. So the question is, if the government feels so philanthropic, to remove taxes on mitumba, the same government proposes to tax knowledge. The same government proposes to tax books. The same government proposes to burden people. The question is, who told them that the mitumba pusher, the farmer, the domestic worker, the watchman who is struggling, would they prefer to see their kids go through school so that they never have to wear mitumba, or would they prefer to wear mitumba today? I can tell you that a majority of Kenyans would prefer to make a sacrifice, educate their children, educate themselves so that they don't need to wear mitumba. Why Singapore cannot think of mitumba? Why the developed countries cannot think of mitumba? Why is it that Kenya has to prioritize mitumba over knowledge and over education and over books? It is a case of failure to prioritize. I think that it boils down just to that. The government is failing to prioritize.
Joe from Kitusuru said it's going to make the already expensive education more elusive, especially students in public schools who already rely on subsidized education, and I think we agree on that.
Now, that's the other problem. Now, if you look at it, and I would like us to be very fair, we are not necessarily attacking private schooling, but who goes to private schools? It's not the ordinary Kenyan who goes to private schools. And people who go to private schools may very well afford, a number of them may afford to purchase that. But how many Kenyans go to private schools? The majority of Kenyans go to those public schools. So they will not have books. So the poor Mkokoteni, the child of the Mkokoteni pusher, see the vicious cycle of that peasant farmer, of that person burning maize on the roadside. They go to a school where they cannot access books, they don't get the right grades, or when they eventually go to the job market, they will not be considered for jobs because they just don't have the requisite knowledge, creativity, and imagination. What the government is proposing is let us keep Kenyans, the majority of Kenyans, poor. This thing about Vision 2030, the whole question is, for who is the Vision 2030? Because from that budget and from the proposal to tax books and knowledge, it cannot be about Kenyans. It has got to be among a few preserved people who can afford it. And those who can afford it, if it becomes too bad, they can also take their kids out of this country to where they can access knowledge and then come back and lord over the children of the peasant who could access quality of the education. And that's why, Florence, we are saying it is such a retrogressive step backwards. We cannot, it's almost unimaginable that the Minister of Finance can tax knowledge and tax books.
Okay. Here Eric Langase says, my question is why now? I smell a rat and this is a political strategy for the election year.
Well, I can't rule out, the callers' contribution, because look, we are saying that actually the real beneficiaries of the mitumba tax break will not be the ordinary Kenyan. It is the well-connected mitumba importers. And so it's not, I don't think it is conjecture when the caller suggests that. It's not. The reality is that those well-connected Mitumba importers are probably the financiers of their candidates. And as Kenyans, I think Kenyans have a right to feel frustrated by the government. Kenyans have a right to imagine that taxing knowledge and education and removing taxes on Mitumba is self-preserving.
But do you feel it's a political strategy for the election year?
It could very well be. It could very well be, because why tax knowledge now? Why remove tax on Mitumbas now? And who complained? Which Kenyans petitioned the government to say Mitumba have become expensive? Because the government ought to be responding to what the people are saying. Meaning that if they're removing taxes on Mitumba, you must have had people petitioning the government to say Mitumba have become too expensive. I have not had any Kenyan suggesting Mitumba have become too expensive. The voices I have heard are the voices of teachers, the voices of parents, the voices of the poor people. Those are the voices I have heard. What is government's response to the voices of the teachers and the voices of the poor and the voices of the workers and the voices of the business people? What is government's response? Tax them more.
Okay. Gitavua from Maimahi says this is wrong because books are essential for education and inclusive in the MDG goals. And I think you've also mentioned that. Moving on, what is the implication of this, of course, to the parents who are obviously maybe going to have to cover this extra cost that is coming in? What do you think it means for them?
Parents should be very afraid, very, very afraid, because for some reasons. Parents should be afraid because, one, even when the government started funding primary education and subsidizing secondary education, we know the budget per child in primary school is about 1,000 shillings.
Yeah, 1,032 shillings.
And 32 shillings. Mm-hmm. And that is for everything, not just books.
Mm-hmm. Per annum.
Per annum. No, not just books. But what is the actual cost of all the books that you are required to purchase? It could very well be between 7,000 and well over 10,000 shillings, you see, for that year. So even the current financing is grossly inadequate. Meaning that if parents, because parents want their kids to have quality education, because you don't want to hear your child will be punished tomorrow because they didn't do homework. Why didn't they do homework? It's not because they are truant, but because they didn't have the textbook. Yeah. Either it is shared or it is non-existent, and then they get punished tomorrow. What happens? Because you don't want your child to miss out on doing their homework and to be punished tomorrow, you have to buy that book. So it will be much worse if books end up being taxed, because government will struggle even more. The ratio of a textbook to children will be probably 1 textbook to 5. We'll just go back, to where we came from. So parents need to be really, really afraid. But the other reason parents need to be afraid is that their kids, our kids, will go to a school system, come out with certificates that mean nothing. And I think employers right now can tell you that part of the big problem in the job market is that you have people with papers, but they don't have the knowledge, the requisite knowledge required to execute on the employment that they have been given. And it's simply because the quality of learning has not been that good. The other thing is that probably there will be an emergence again. We know that when the public school system started crumbling about 20-something years ago, in the mid-80s, there was the emergence of a private school for those who could afford to do that. Mm. And so we will have a nation with Kenyans on the first lane who have access to quality of education. They end up taking up their positions in universities. They end up taking the jobs. And then we'll have the majority of Kenyans on the slow pace who will be burdened with the cost of education. They take their kids to school because they didn't acquire the necessary knowledge. They don't have the jobs, and the cycle of poverty continues. I think that's what this government is saying. Let's just create an economy, fast lane economy, for those who have the bucks, and the rest, hopefully Vision 2030, somehow, abracadabra, something will happen, and maybe they will catch up.
So what is the way forward? What is the way forward?
I think the way forward is for government not to bury its head in the sand. Some of the reason being given for taxing, slapping VAT on books is because they want an easier way of managing tax. Who employed and paid people so heavily to have an easy time? They are paid to be imaginative, because that's how the rest of the world basically is. And if the kitchen is too hot for you, just get out and let other people who have new ideas, fresh ideas, and who think not just in the box or out of the box, but they have basically thrown the box away. They've taken the box, said, we are not even thinking out of it. Just throw it away, and let's have a fresh way of thinking. We need leaders with a new paradigm, and that's why probably the way forward, I think the next election presents a great opportunity, to have people who are more progressive, and we hope really that it doesn't have to get there. We hope the current government can play their role, roll up their sleeves, look at how the other modern economies, the policies they have created. Even UK, our colonial masters themselves, they can't think of taxing books. The big debate in the UK right now is for the government not to lower the tax of e-books, because e-books are taxed not at the normal rate, but at a lower rate, and they want even that zero rated. But printed books are not taxed even in the UK. Is there any wonder, therefore, that everybody you find will be holding a book? No. So I think the way forward is just to listen to the voices of the people, number one. Number two is to stop being reactive. Simply because we had a big budget deficit last year, now let's do this. I think policy and the execution of policy should always be in the light of the long-term goals. In other words, we should develop a vision that says that's where we want to go, and then develop plans that help us get closer to those visions. The problem with Kenya is that we have a Vision 2030, but everything we do right now doesn't take us closer to Vision 2030. It takes us further away. Taxing knowledge, discouraging people to access knowledge is a retrogressive action. It takes us further away. We will have, in 2030, we'll have less imaginative people. We will have less and less innovative society if the government has its way on taxing knowledge.
Okay. You've had it for yourself. Today we were with Mr. David Waweru, the CEO of Wildlife Publishers, talking about the VAT Bill 2011 that proposes taxation on books. And thank you so much for all your comments and the questions that you have sent us. If you have anything else that you want to say, you can send it on our address. You can still send an SMS on 32223, starting with the word Afternoon Live, or you can send us an email on afternoonlive@kbc.co.ke. Remember, our show is live every Monday and Friday from 12 to 1 p.m., so keep watching us. Thank you.
The house that
Channel 1, Kenya's watching.
Hand washing with soap is able to reduce diarrhea incidences by almost 50% and upper respiratory infections by 25%. hand washing champion too. Wash your hands with soap.
This public health message is brought to you by Dettol and the Kenya Medical Association. Clean hands, save lives.
Trademark has become his most difficult dive. 4.5 somersaults